My son invited me to dinner. He said he had something important to discuss, something about the family's future. An hour before I was supposed to leave, as I was fastening a pair of cufflinks my late wife gave me, my lawyer sent me a text. It had only 3 words, all in capital letters. He told me the terrible truth about my son, and why that dinner was not a family gathering, but an ambush. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from, and be sure to like and subscribe if you believe that wisdom is a quiet weapon that should never be underestimated. The silence in my study was a comfortable old friend. It was the kind of deep-settled quiet that only comes from a life surrounded by books, their leather and paper spines absorbing the sharp edges of the world. I was preparing to go to my son Kevin's house for dinner. The ritual was a familiar one. I stood before the small mahogany valet stand near my window, a place where the late afternoon sun cast long, gentle shadows across the room. On its polished surface lay a pair of silver cufflinks, each one a simple, elegant knot. They were a gift from my wife Clara for our 25th anniversary, years before she passed. Polishing them with a soft cloth was more than a habit. It was a communion, a way of carrying her with me into the evening. The faint scent of lemon oil from the wood and the dusty fragrance of old books filled the air. My home, a historic brownstone just outside Philadelphia, was my sanctuary. Every object held a story, every corner a memory. The walls lined floor to ceiling with oak shelves were not just for storage. They were a testament to a life spent in the patient, meticulous world of restoring rare books and manuscripts. Order, history, and dignity. Those were the principles I lived by. And then a sound completely alien to that peace. A sharp, insistent buzz vibrated across the wooden valet, making the cufflinks dance for a fraction of a second. My phone. I rarely received messages in the evening. My circle had grown smaller over the years, more focused. I picked it up expecting a reminder from the local historical society, or perhaps a note from a former colleague. But the name on the screen made my breath catch. David Chen. My lawyer, and more than that, my friend for nearly 40 years. Below his name was a message of only 3 words, but they were typed in the cold, stark finality of capital letters. Call me immediately. My heart, which had been beating with the steady, calm rhythm of a grandfather clock, gave a sudden, painful lurch. David was the epitome of professional composure. He was a man who communicated in carefully drafted emails and scheduled appointments. In 4 decades of friendship and legal counsel, he had never used such language. Never. It was the digital equivalent of a siren screaming in my quiet, orderly world. The contrast between the tranquil scene around me and the stark urgency of those 3 words created a chasm in the air. Something was terribly wrong. I dialed his number, my fingers feeling strangely clumsy. The phone barely completed a full ring before he answered. There was no preamble, no "Hello, Edward. How are you?" Just his voice, stripped of all pleasantries, tight and strained. Ed. Thank you for calling back so quickly. Are you alone? Can you speak freely? I was sitting in my leather armchair now, the silver cufflinks still clutched in my other hand, their metal cool against my palm. Yes, David. I'm at home. I was just getting ready to leave. What's happened? He took a deep breath, and I could hear the rustle of papers on his end. It was the sound of a lawyer preparing to deliver devastating news. My office just received a courtesy copy of a legal petition filed this morning at the county courthouse. It involves you. I waited. The silence stretched thick with unspoken dread. David had handled our family's affairs since my father's time. He helped me set up my business. He drafted my will with Clara. He knew every financial and personal detail of my life. He was the guardian of our family's legal history. The petition, David said, his voice low and measured, was filed by Kevin. The name hung in the air between us. Kevin. My son. He is petitioning the court for an emergency conservatorship over you and your estate. The words didn't seem to make sense at first. Conservatorship. It was a term I associated with the very old, the very ill people who had truly lost their way in the world. It couldn't possibly apply to me. On what grounds, I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I could hear David turn a page. He began to read, and the words he spoke were a clinical, brutal assault. The filing alleges a significant and progressive decline in your cognitive capacity. He paused. It claims you are no longer capable of managing your own financial affairs in a rational manner. And it states you have become, and I quote, susceptible to undue influence from external parties. Each phrase was a carefully chosen legal dagger designed to paint me as a frail, incompetent old man. It was a portrait of someone I didn't recognize. The dinner invitation from Kevin suddenly clicked into place, not as a gesture of affection, but as a piece of a horrifying puzzle. David, I said, my voice gaining a hard, clear edge. He invited me to his house for dinner tonight. There was a heavy sigh on the other end of the line. Of course he did, David said, his tone laced with a weary disgust. Ed, listened to me very carefully. That dinner is not a family meal, it's an evaluation. He's likely to have someone there, a doctor, a psychologist, someone who can act as a witness to your supposed decline. They will be watching everything you do, everything you say. It's a trap. I hung up the phone. The silence that rushed back into the room was different now. It was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, filled with the echo of David's words. My son. My own son was trying to have me declared mentally incompetent. He was trying to strip me of my autonomy, my home, my life's work. He was trying to erase me while I was still living. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel panic. What settled over me was a profound and chilling clarity, like a shard of ice forming in my chest. All the small, unsettling moments from the past few months suddenly snapped into focus. Kevin's insistent questions about my portfolio. His casual remarks about the house being too big for one person. His wife Jessica's overly sweet inquiries about whether I was remembering to take my pills. They weren't expressions of concern. They were reconnaissance. I looked across the room at the framed photograph on my desk. It was of Clara, taken in the garden behind our house. She was smiling, her eyes full of the intelligence and warmth that I had loved for 45 years. What would she have said? She would have told me to be smart. She would have told me to be strong. She would have told me to fight. My first instinct was to call Kevin and cancel, to unleash the torrent of betrayal and hurt that was building inside me. But that's what he would expect. He was counting on an emotional, perhaps confused reaction from an old man. That would be playing right into his hands. And so I made a decision. I would not cancel dinner. I would go, but I would not be walking in as his father, a guest in his home. I would be walking in as an adversary. He had started a war without my knowledge, but he had made a critical error. He had revealed his entire strategy to me before the first battle had even begun. He thought he was setting a trap for a feeble old man. He had no idea he was about to face the man who had taught him how to play chess. I stood up and walked back to the valet stand. My hands were perfectly steady now. I picked up the silver cufflinks, the knots of metal feeling solid and reassuring in my grasp. I pushed one through the starched white cuff of my shirt, then the other, the quiet click of the fastenings sounding like the loading of a weapon. When I looked at my reflection in the dark wood of the stand, the man looking back was not a victim. His eyes were clear and cold. I was ready. The war for my life had just begun. The drive to Kevin's house was a journey through a life he thought he knew. The familiar streets of my neighborhood, lined with old oak trees and houses that had stood for a century, felt different now, like a set from a play whose script had been suddenly and cruelly rewritten. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and bruised purple, casting long shadows that seemed to claw at the road ahead. My hands were steady on the leather-wrapped steering wheel of my old reliable sedan. The car was like me, a product of a different era built with solid steel and an engine you could understand just by listening to it. Inside, however, my mind was a storm of memories, each one a piece of a puzzle I was only now beginning to solve. David's words echoed with every quiet hum of the tires on the asphalt. Diminished cognitive capacity. Unable to manage his own financial affairs. The phrases were so clinical, so impersonal, yet they felt like a physical violation. I thought back to a lunch just a month ago. Kevin had insisted we meet at his club, a place of dark wood, polished brass, and hushed important conversations. It was all very sleek, very modern, a world away from the comfortable clutter of my own home. Over plates of artfully arranged food, he had leaned forward with that earnest, concerned expression he had perfected. "Dad," he'd said, his voice a smooth blend of respect and authority. "Are you sure it's wise to be managing that portfolio all by yourself? The market is so volatile these days. One wrong move." He had let the sentence hang in the air, a benevolent warning. At the time, I had seen it as a son's concern, perhaps a clumsy attempt to connect with my world. Now I saw it for what it was, a probe, a test to see how tightly I was holding the reins. And Jessica, a week later, calling me on the phone, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Edward, we were just so worried. Kevin mentioned you seemed a bit forgetful last time we spoke. Are you remembering to take your vitamins? It's so important for your memory, you know." It was always framed as love, as care. They would exchange these quick, knowing glances, small shared smiles that I had interpreted as the language of a loving couple. Now I understood. It was the silent communication of co-conspirators. Every question about my health, every feigned worry about my safety in the large house, it wasn't about my well-being. It was about building a case. They were collecting anecdotes, twisting moments of normal forgetfulness into evidence for their narrative of my decline. They were termites quietly chewing away at the foundations of my life, all while telling me what a beautiful house I had. The memory that truly chilled me, however, was from 2 months prior. It was the moment the mask had truly slipped, and I, in my fatherly love, had chosen to tuck it right back into place for him. He had come to my study, his energy too large and restless for the quiet space. He was buzzing with an idea, a high-risk real estate venture, involving luxury condos in a developing tech hub. He spread glossy brochures across my antique desk, the images of steel and glass looking obscene next to my collection of 18th century manuscripts. He wanted a significant investment, a sum that would have required me to liquidate a substantial portion of my carefully curated, low-risk bonds. I listened patiently, and then after reviewing the prospectus, I gave him my honest assessment. It was a gamble pure and simple, built on speculation and debt. I told him no. The change in his demeanor was instantaneous. The charming, enthusiastic son vanished, replaced by a cold, petulant stranger. His face tightened, his eyes narrowed, and then he said the words that I had tried so hard to forget. "It's my future money anyway, Dad. You're just the one holding on to it for now." The sentence had struck me with the force of a physical blow, the sheer naked entitlement of it. For a moment I was speechless. This fortune, this home, this life, it was not something I was simply holding. It was the result of 50 years of hard work, of prudent saving, of a partnership with his mother, built on shared dreams and quiet sacrifices. It was the legacy I hoped to leave him, yes, but a legacy is a gift, not a debt. At the time, I had chalked it up to the arrogance of a young man immersed in the cutthroat world of finance, a world where everything had a price tag and nothing had any real value. I had pushed the comment aside, burying it under the hope that my son was better than his worst impulses. But as I turned onto his street, the sterile, oversized houses standing in perfect manicured rows, I finally allowed myself to face the truth. That wasn't an impulse. That was his core belief. He saw me not as his father, but as a stubborn gatekeeper, a custodian of his inheritance who was living too long and thinking too clearly. I had felt the cold chill of his ambition that day in my study, a deep instinctual warning that something was fundamentally broken in him. But I had ignored it. I hadn't wanted to see it. Hadn't wanted to believe that the boy I had raised could look at me and see only a dollar sign. That was my failure. Not a failure of mind, as he claimed in his legal papers, but a failure of the heart. I had loved him too much to see him for who he truly was. That blindness ended tonight. The truth was, this battle hadn't started an hour ago with David's phone call. It had started a week ago in the quiet wood-paneled confines of his office. The vague unease that had been gathering in the back of my mind, that persistent low hum of wrongness, had finally become too loud to ignore. It was the accumulation of Kevin's probing questions and Jessica's saccharine concern culminating in that ugly moment in my study over the real estate deal. So I had called David. I hadn't told him I suspected my son of plotting against me. That would have sounded insane, the ramblings of a paranoid old man. Instead, I had framed it as simple prudence, the responsible act of a man in his 70s getting his affairs in order. David, I'd said over the phone, I think it's time for a thorough review. The will, the estate, the trusts, everything. I just want to make sure all the language is ironclad. He had agreed without question, and we met the following Tuesday. His office, much like my study, was a place of comforting order. Law books bound in dark leather stood in silent, watchful rows. The only art on the wall was his framed law degree and a tasteful black and white photograph of the Supreme Court building. We sat across from his large mahogany desk, a pot of fresh coffee between us. I laid out my feelings not as accusations, but as observations. I spoke of Kevin's newfound and intense interest in my finances. I mentioned the odd conversation about the house. I described a general feeling of being assessed. I watched David's face as I spoke. He listened without interruption, his hands steepled before him. He was a master at seeing the patterns ordinary people missed. He saw the legal shapes that shadows could take. He didn't call me paranoid. He didn't dismiss my concerns. He simply nodded slowly, his expression growing more serious with each detail I shared. He knew my son. He had seen him grow from a bright, ambitious boy into a driven and perhaps ruthless man. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "It's always wise to be prepared for any eventuality, Ed. Let's look at your options for protecting your legacy, not just distributing it." He had understood the unspoken fear behind my words. It was David who first mentioned the specific legal instrument. He called it the ultimate defense of a legacy, an irrevocable trust. He explained it to me with calm, deliberate clarity. It was a fortress. Any asset placed within its walls would no longer belong to me in the eyes of the law. It would belong to the trust itself, managed by a trustee, me in this case, for the sole benefit of a designated beneficiary. Once the papers were signed and the trust was funded, the action could not be undone. Not by me, not by a court, not by anyone. It was a final, permanent act. This is not a shield, Ed, he had warned me, his eyes locking onto mine. This is a Götterdämmerung, a twilight of the gods. You would be willingly giving up control of everything you've built to protect it. You must be absolutely certain. At the time, I wasn't certain. I was merely cautious. But I agreed that we should prepare the documents. It felt like assembling a weapon that I prayed I would never have to use. We spent the rest of the afternoon outlining the terms. The beneficiary was an easy choice, a foundation to be established in Clara's name, dedicated to the preservation of literature and the arts. It was the perfect tribute to her, a way to make our shared life's work immortal. David's paralegals drafted the extensive paperwork. They prepared the deeds for the house, the transfer agreements for the investment portfolio, the legal charter for the foundation. By the end of the week, a thick binder sat in David's office vault, a complete and total restructuring of my existence waiting for a final command. It was a sleeping giant. We had left it at that. A contingency plan. A defense against a threat I still hoped was just a product of my own anxieties. But David's call tonight, that had been the signal. That had been the flare in the darkness confirming that the threat was real, that it was imminent, and that it was time to awaken the giant. The petition for conservatorship was my son's declaration of war, my quiet instruction to David over the phone just a few minutes ago. David, proceed. Activate everything. That was my answer. My son had no idea. He thought he was walking into a dinner with his forgetful old father. He couldn't possibly imagine that by the time he shook my hand at his front door, he would already be completely and irrevocably disinherited. Kevin's street was 2 blocks away. I saw the familiar turnoff, the one I had taken for countless birthdays, holidays, and Sunday dinners over the years. But I drove past it. I needed a moment. I needed to stand on solid ground before I stepped into the quicksand he had prepared for me. I pulled the car over to the curb on a quiet, tree-lined side street. The houses here were older, more modest than my son's ostentatious mansion. An amber streetlight flickered on, casting a lonely theatrical glow into the car's interior. For a moment, I just sat there, my hands resting on the steering wheel, watching the last vestiges of daylight fade from the sky. There was no hesitation in my heart. There was no doubt. There was only the cold, hard certainty of a necessary act. I took out my phone. The screen's bright light felt like an intrusion in the dim car. My thumb hovered over David's name for a second, not in indecision, but in acknowledgement of the finality of what I was about to do. This was the moment the old world ended. I pressed the call button. He answered on the first ring, his voice as calm and ready as my own. "Ed," he asked, though he already knew. "It's time, David," I said. My voice was steady even. "Proceed. Activate everything." There was a brief pause on the other end, the sound of a man taking a single professional breath before executing a command of great consequence. "Understood," he replied. His tone was all business now. "The transfer documents will be filed electronically with the county registrar's office and the bank's trust department. The process will take approximately 15 minutes to become legally binding. The Foundation's charter will be activated simultaneously. Once I hit send, Edward, it is final. It is irrevocable." I knew what he was asking. He was giving me one last chance to turn back. "I understand," I said. "Thank you, David. For everything." "Godspeed, my friend," he said. And the line went dead. I lowered the phone. A life's work, a family's legacy, decades of accumulation and careful planning, all of it was now in motion, being transferred and transformed by the silent, instantaneous language of the law. I had just set fire to the bridge that connected my son's future to my past. There was no going back. But there was one more call to make. This one was different. It wasn't about legal structures or financial portfolios. It was about my soul. I scrolled through my contacts and found the name Mark. Mark wasn't just a rare book broker. He was one of the few people left in the world who understood what my collection truly represented. He understood the art of the bookbinder, the history held in a watermark, the soul of a story that had survived for centuries. He understood that my library was not an asset. It was a life. He answered with his usual warm, scholarly tone. "Edward, I was hoping I wouldn't hear from you tonight." He knew what this call meant. "Hello, Mark," I said. "The time has come. The arrangement we discussed for the collection, we are moving forward." There was a quiet sigh on his end. "I am truly sorry it has come to this, Edward," he said, his voice full of genuine empathy. "But I assure you, the university's special collections department is ready. They understand the honor they are being given. The Clara Coleman Reading Room will be a beautiful tribute. Her name and yours will be properly honored." I closed my eyes. The Clara Coleman Reading Room. It was perfect. "Thank you, Mark." That is all I needed to hear, I told him. I will be sending the final formal email confirmation within the hour. We said our goodbyes, and I ended the call. I placed the phone on the passenger seat and took a long, slow breath. The air filled my lungs, and as I exhaled, I felt the weight of decades lift from my shoulders. The weight of expectation. The weight of a father's strained hope. The weight of a legacy I had carried for a son who saw it only as a burden to be monetized. It was all gone. I was no longer the custodian of Kevin's inheritance. I was now simply Edward Coleman, a man with a modest annual stipend and a life to live. I felt free. A profound, quiet, and powerful sense of liberation. I put the car in drive, signaled, and pulled away from the curb, turning back towards my son's street. The battle was still to come, but he didn't know it yet. The war had already been won. I pulled into the long paved driveway and put the car in park. Kevin's house was not so much a home as it was a statement. It was a massive structure of glass steel and stark white stucco, a collection of imposing geometric shapes that seemed to have been dropped onto the perfectly manicured lawn from a great height. There were no gentle slopes to the roof and no welcoming porch, no history in its clean, unforgiving lines. It was a house that valued privacy over community, a fortress designed to keep the world out. As I walked up the slate pathway, I couldn't help but contrast it with my own home, a place of warm brick and weathered wood, a house that had settled comfortably into the earth over 100 years, its walls saturated with the quiet stories of a life well lived. My home smelled of old paper lemon oil and baked bread. This place, I imagined, smelled only of glass cleaner and money. The heavy front door swung open before I had a chance to ring the bell, as if they had been watching for me. And there they were, my son and his wife, framed in the doorway like a portrait of modern success. Kevin was dressed in expensive casual wear that was meant to look effortless, but was in fact meticulously curated. Jessica stood beside him, a vision in cream-colored silk, her blonde hair styled with a precision that defied gravity. But it was their smiles that struck me the most. They were enormous, dazzling, perfectly white, and utterly devoid of warmth. They were the smiles of people posing for a magazine, not a father being welcomed into his son's home. "Dad." Kevin boomed, his voice unnaturally cheerful. "You're here, we were getting worried." He stepped forward and gave me a brisk one-armed hug that was more of a pat on the back. Jessica glided in after him, placing a light, airy kiss somewhere in the vicinity of my cheek. Her perfume was expensive and overwhelming. "Edward, it's so wonderful to see you," she cooed. Her eyes, however, were not smiling. They were scanning me, assessing my posture, my clothes, my expression. I was not a guest. I was an exhibit. I smiled back, playing my part. "It's good to see you too. You have a beautiful home." They led me inside into a cavernous great room with a 20-foot ceiling and a wall of glass that overlooked a sterile, perfectly blue swimming pool. The furniture was sparse and angular. The art on the walls was abstract and aggressive, and there were no photographs, no clutter, no signs of actual life. It was like walking into the lobby of a luxury hotel. And then I saw her. Seated in a severe-looking armchair that seemed designed more for interrogation than comfort, was a woman I had never seen before. She was perhaps in her late 50s, dressed in a sharp professional blazer, her graying hair cut into a neat, no-nonsense bob. She held a glass of water in her hands and watched my entrance with a look of calm, neutral appraisal. She was not a casual guest. Kevin gestured towards her with a sweeping, magnanimous motion. "Dad, I want you to meet a very dear friend of ours," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "This is Dr. Annabelle Sterling." The word doctor landed in the air with deliberate weight. I walked towards her, my hand outstretched, a polite, grandfatherly smile fixed on my face. Inside, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This was the expert. This was the impartial observer who would testify to my diminished capacity. She was here to document every pause in my speech, every repeated anecdote, every moment of perceived confusion, and translate it into the cold, damning language of a psychiatric evaluation. I took her hand. Her grip was firm, dry, and professional. It was not the handshake of a friend. Her eyes, a pale, intelligent blue, met mine. They were not unkind, but they were deeply, intensely analytical. They were the eyes of a scientist observing a specimen trained to notice every detail, to categorize every behavior, to remain objective and emotionally detached. I knew her type. I had worked with academics and specialists my entire life. They had a way of looking at the world, of breaking it down into data points. At that moment, I was a data point. "Dr. Sterling," I said, my voice warm and friendly. "It's an absolute pleasure to meet you. Any friend of Kevin's is a friend of mine." She gave a small professional smile in return. "The pleasure is all mine, Mr. Coleman. I've heard so much about you." I was sure she had. I could almost see the file in her mind, the one my son had so generously provided, filled with his carefully selected stories of my supposed failings. The ambush was no longer a theory. I was standing in the middle of it. The trap was set, and the hunters were smiling at me, completely unaware that their prey knew exactly where every snare was hidden. We moved to the dining room, a space that felt more like a corporate boardroom than a place for a family to share a meal. A long, dark table of polished wood stretched across the room, reflecting the cold, modern chandelier that hung above it like a crystalline spider. The place settings were perfect, the silverware aligned with geometric precision, the wineglasses gleaming untouched. It was a scene of calculated perfection, and I was the single flawed element they intended to document and remove. The meal was served by a silent, efficient caterer, allowing my hosts to focus their full attention on their project, the gentle, loving dismantling of my competence. The conversation began, as I knew it would, with a trip down memory lane, a path carefully curated by Kevin to lead directly to his desired destination. He laughed, a loud, artificial sound that echoed slightly in the minimalist room. "Dad, Jessica and I were just talking about this the other day. Do you remember that summer we went to the lake, and you left the car keys in the refrigerator? You were so sure you'd lost them. We spent 2 hours looking for them in the hot sun." Jessica chimed in, placing a hand on his arm in a gesture of shared fond remembrance. "Oh, that was hilarious. And Edward, remember last Christmas when you were telling us about your trip to Boston, and you couldn't remember the name of the museum you visited? You kept calling it the Big Art Building." She smiled at me, a soft, pitying smile that was more insulting than any frown. Each story was an exhibit presented as a charming family anecdote, but intended as a data point for Dr. Sterling's unwritten report. Exhibit A, short-term memory loss. Exhibit B, confusion regarding common nouns. Dr. Sterling, for her part, played her role with masterful subtlety. She would lean forward, her expression one of genuine interest, and ask seemingly harmless follow-up questions. "That sounds like a wonderful trip to the lake, Edward. What year was that, do you recall?" A test of long-term memory. Later, as Kevin discussed a recent political event, she turned to me. "It's all so confusing to keep track of these days, isn't it? I was just saying to my husband, who is the current mayor of Philadelphia, now I seem to have completely forgotten." A test of orientation to current events. They were weaving a web of my own memories, my own life, and using it to trap me. Every word, every question, every shared laugh was a thread in that web. They thought I was a fly growing weaker with every struggle. They had no idea I was the spider. And so I began my performance. I allowed a look of faint confusion to cross my face as Kevin told his story. "The keys in the refrigerator." I said, my voice a little distant. Goodness, did I really do that? I suppose I must have. My memory for little things. It's not quite what it used to be. I chuckled along with them, a soft, self-deprecating sound that I knew they would interpret as the sad acceptance of a failing mind. I gave them the gift of my weakness. When Jessica brought up the museum in Boston, I waved a dismissive hand, a gesture of mild frustration. Ah, yes. The details. They seem to slip away these days. So many museums, so many years. I let my sentence trail off as if the effort to complete it was simply too much. I was giving them exactly the material they needed, feeding their narrative with perfectly crafted moments of feigned senility. When Dr. Sterling asked about the mayor, I hesitated. I looked up at the ceiling, as if searching for the name. Oh, let me see, I mused. The mayor. Wasn't it that fellow? Nutter, no, he was years ago. It's on the tip of my tongue. I looked at her with a slightly embarrassed smile. I'm sorry, Doctor. The name escapes me at the moment. I could see the glint in Kevin's eye. It was a flicker of pure, unadulterated triumph. It was the look of a predator who sees its prey stumble. He thought my performance was real. He saw my deliberate pauses as cognitive lapses, my feigned confusion as genuine decline. He would occasionally catch Jessica's eye, a minute, almost imperceptible nod passing between them. It's working, the glance said. He's exactly as we hoped. I made sure to ask simple questions that could be construed as disorientation. Is this the fish or the chicken, dear, my eyesight in this light? Or, remind me, Kevin, what is it your company does again? Something with computers, isn't it? Each question was a confirmation for them and them, another nail in the coffin of my legal competence. They were so busy congratulating themselves on their cleverness that they failed to notice the cold, steady calm behind my supposedly cloudy eyes. They failed to see that I was not just playing a role. I was directing the entire scene. I was letting them build their case brick by brick on a foundation of lies. I was allowing them their moment of victory, letting them climb as high as they could on their mountain of arrogance. The higher they climbed, the more satisfying the fall would be. The dessert plates were cleared away, and a rich, dark coffee was poured into thin porcelain cups. A silence descended upon the table, but it was not a comfortable one. It was the charged, expectant silence of a theater right before the third act begins. Kevin cleared his throat, a small, deliberate sound that drew all attention to him. Dr. Sterling shifted in her chair, her posture subtly changing from that of a dinner guest to that of a clinical observer. Jessica folded her hands on the table, her face arranged into a mask of solemn concern. The performance was about to reach its climax. Kevin reached across the table and placed his hand over mine. His touch was cool and dry, a proprietary gesture disguised as affection. He looked at me, his eyes wide and earnest, the very picture of a devoted son. Dad, he began, his voice low and saturated with a carefully rehearsed sincerity. Jessica and I have been, we've been very worried about you lately. He squeezed my hand. You've done so much for me, for this family, your entire life. You worked so hard to build everything to provide for Mom and me. And now it's our turn to take care of you. He glanced at Jessica, who nodded in perfect supportive synchrony. We just want to make sure that you're safe, that you're looked after, and that the beautiful legacy you and Mom built is protected. The word protected hung in the air, a beautiful poisonous flower. Protected from what? From whom? My internal voice was cold and clear. The only threat to my legacy was sitting right in front of me, holding my hand and trying to look like a savior. He went on, his voice weaving a narrative of my supposed vulnerability, of the complexities of the modern world, of the burden of managing a large estate alone. It was a masterful speech full of loving phrases and concerned tones, and every word of it was a lie. I watched him, this stranger who wore my son's face, and I felt a profound sense of detachment. I was no longer a father listening to his child. I was a craftsman observing a poorly made forgery and noting every single flaw. He let go of my hand and leaned back in his chair, adopting the tone of a man who must now discuss difficult practical matters. Dad, because we are so concerned, we felt it was our responsibility to take a more active role in helping you manage your finances, he said, as if offering a generous gift. And to do that properly, to really have the ability to protect you from mistakes or from people who might try to take advantage of your good nature, we've had to begin a certain legal process. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. He looked directly at me, then gave a quick, almost imperceptible glance towards Dr. Sterling, the expert witness. This was it. This was the moment the trap was meant to spring shut. It's just a formality, really. He continued, his voice softening into a soothing murmur. It's a legal safeguard that the lawyers advised us to put in place. It's for your own good, for your own protection. It gives us the tools we need to help you. He didn't use the word conservatorship. It was too ugly, too brutal. He wrapped the cage in soft velvet, hoping I wouldn't notice the bars. He fell silent. He had laid his cards on the table. The room was utterly still. 3 sets of eyes were fixed on me. Kevin's were full of a predatory pity, the look of a victor offering false sympathy to the vanquished. Jessica's were anxious, but hopeful. Dr. Sterling's were neutral, observant, recording every twitch of my facial muscles, every beat of silence. They were all waiting. They were waiting for the confusion. They were waiting for the outburst of impotent rage. They were waiting for the frightened, rambling denials of a senile old man whose world was crumbling around him. Any of those reactions would be a victory for them, a final confirmation of everything they had claimed in their legal petition. I looked at my son. I saw the faint sheen of sweat on his brow, the slight eager lean in his posture. He thought he had me cornered. He thought he had won. I felt no anger. I felt no fear. I felt only a profound, liberating calm. The calm of a chess master who sees his opponent make the exact fatal move he knew he would make all along. I held his gaze, and for the first time all evening I let my polite grandfatherly mask fall away. I let him see the clarity in my eyes. And then I gave him a small, slow smile. The silence in the room stretched, growing heavier with each passing second. Kevin leaned forward, his face a mask of predatory concern, waiting for the confused, emotional outburst that would seal his victory. He was waiting for the frightened animal to thrash in the trap. But the animal did not thrash. I held my son's gaze, and my small, calm smile did not waver. I saw the first flicker of doubt in his eyes, a tiny crack in his perfect, arrogant facade. He had prepared for a storm, but he had no idea what to do with this profound and unnerving quiet. With a slow, deliberate motion that felt magnified in the stillness, I lifted my linen napkin from my lap. I folded it neatly in half and then in half again, and placed it gently on the table beside my plate. It was a simple act, the kind of gesture one makes at the end of a pleasant meal, and its very normality seemed to unnerve them more than any shout could have. Dr. Sterling's professional neutrality wavered. A slight frown creased her brow. Jessica shifted uncomfortably in her seat. My composure was not part of their script. Then I spoke. My voice was not angry, not shaky, not loud. It was conversational, almost gentle, the voice of a man asking a simple, clarifying question. You mentioned protecting my assets, Kevin, I said. My eyes still locked on his. Which assets specifically were you concerned about, the house? The question hung in the air, simple and direct. It completely dismantled his carefully constructed narrative of my confusion. I was not rambling. I was asking for specifics. He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape, the condescending speech he had prepared dying on his lips. Before he could formulate a response, I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. All 3 of them watched the movement, their attention fixed on my hand. I retrieved a single crisp white envelope. I did not toss it onto the table. I placed it down softly, and then with one finger I slid it across the polished wood. It glided silently, like a ship on a dark, calm sea, coming to a stop directly in front of my son. You might want to talk to the new owners about the house, I said, my voice maintaining that same placid tone. They take possession this Friday. Kevin looked from my face to the envelope and back again, his mind visibly struggling to process my words. The smug confidence had vanished, replaced by a raw, naked confusion. He snatched the envelope from the table, his movements suddenly clumsy and uncertain. He fumbled with the flap, tearing it open, with a ragged sound that was startlingly loud in the silent room. He pulled out the contents. I knew what he was holding. I had put them in the envelope myself that afternoon. The first was a business card, thick and embossed with the name of one of the most prestigious real estate firms in Philadelphia. The second was a single sheet of paper. From across the table I could see the bold heading, Contract of Sale, and below it the address of my home, the home where he had grown up, the home he had considered his birthright. And beneath that, a large official stamp in red ink, its letters sharp and undeniable, sold. The silence that followed was no longer expectant. It was the absolute, deafening silence of a vacuum, the kind of silence that follows a sudden violent change in pressure. I watched the color drain from Kevin's face, leaving it a sickly, grayish white. His eyes were wide, fixed on the paper in his hand, as if trying to will the words away. He looked up at me, his expression one of complete, uncomprehending shock. This was impossible. This could not be happening. His entire plan, his petition to the court, was predicated on my inability to manage my own affairs. And I, this confused, forgetful old man, had just executed a multi-million-dollar real estate transaction right under his nose. Jessica, seeing the look on her husband's face, let out a tiny, strangled gasp. Her eyes darted from him to me and back again. And then came a sound that broke the spell, a sound so small and yet so shatteringly final. The dessert spoon in her hand, forgotten, slipped from her nerveless grasp. It fell clattering loudly against her porcelain plate. The sharp metallic clink echoed through the room, a perfect jarring punctuation to the utter demolition of their plans. I said nothing. I simply sat there, my hands resting in my lap, and watched their carefully constructed world begin to fall apart. This was only the beginning. Before Kevin could find his voice, before the shock in the room could curdle into anger, I continued. I did not raise my voice. I did not allow a single note of triumph to enter my tone. I spoke with the calm, dispassionate authority of a man reading a final, binding judgment. The clatter of Jessica's spoon still seemed to hang in the air, a ghost of a sound. I looked past her, past Dr. Sterling's now wide and unprofessional eyes, and settled my gaze once more on my son. That sale, Kevin, was merely the first step in simplifying my estate. I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the thick silence. A piece of necessary housekeeping, you might say. But that brings us to the more substantial matter. The matter of what you called the beautiful legacy I've built. I let the words hang there for a beat, letting him remember his own manipulative speech. And as for the rest of my assets, I began ticking them off with a slow, deliberate cadence, including the entire investment portfolio managed by Vanguard, the entirety of my rare book collection valued last month by Sotheby's, and of course all the liquid proceeds from the sale of the house we just discussed. I paused. I watched as a desperate, flickering hope ignited in Kevin's eyes. The house was gone, yes, but this was the real prize. This was the generational wealth he had been banking on his entire adult life. He was still leaning forward, a drowning man searching for a piece of driftwood in a vast and empty ocean. I saw the calculation in his eyes, the frantic reassessment. He thought he had misplayed his hand, but he believed the game was still on. He believed there was still something left for him to take. I let him have that single fleeting moment of hope, and then I extinguished it completely. All of those assets, I concluded, my voice dropping slightly, but losing none of its precision, have been transferred, as of approximately 1 hour ago, into a newly chartered, irrevocable trust. It is a legal entity established under the name the Clara Coleman Literary Legacy Fund. I said his mother's name slowly with reverence. In that sterile, soulless room, Her name felt like a prayer, a shield against the avarice that surrounded me. As a man of finance, Kevin understood the word irrevocable better than anyone. It was not a suggestion. It was a legal tombstone. It was the sound of a door being slammed shut, bolted, and locked. Forever. I decided to provide him with a brief final lesson. My tone was that of a professor explaining a complex theorem to a student who had fundamentally misunderstood the entire subject. An irrevocable trust. As you may know, Kevin is a permanent legal structure, I explained. Looking at him as he sat frozen, his face a canvas of disbelief and dawning horror. The assets within it no longer belong to the grantor. They belong to the trust itself in perpetuity. I folded my hands on the table. According to the charter of the fund, which David Chen and I drafted with meticulous care, the entirety of its annual earnings will be used for a few specific purposes. It will provide grants to public libraries in underserved communities. It will fund a series of university scholarships for promising students of literature and history. And it will acquire and preserve rare and significant works of art and literature, ensuring they are protected for future generations. I let that sink in. I had taken the wealth he coveted and transformed it into the very thing he despised, a public good, a monument to the world of ideas and history he had always dismissed as my quaint, unprofitable hobby. As the trustee, I continued, the fund will provide me with a modest annual stipend, sufficient for my needs and my comfort for the remainder of my life. It will allow me to live simply and to continue my work without financial concern. I then turned my head slightly so that I was looking at both Kevin and his wife Jessica, whose face had crumpled into a mask of pure, ugly disbelief. I delivered the final verdict in plain, simple terms, leaving no room for misunderstanding, no space for false hope. The sole and permanent beneficiary of the trust is the legacy of your mother, a legacy of knowledge, of beauty, and of charity. You, Kevin, and you, Jessica, are not named as beneficiaries. You will not receive a single dollar from the fund. Not now and not upon my death. It is all gone. Permanently. The last word landed in the center of the table with the dead weight of a stone. They had come to dinner expecting to seize a kingdom. I had left them with nothing but the bill for the meal. The room was a vacuum, all the air sucked out by the force of my final words. I watched the emotions play across my son's face, a terrible, rapid progression. The initial slack-jawed shock hardened into a pale, waxy mask of disbelief. He looked like a statue of himself. Then, as the full, irreversible reality of his situation began to dawn on him, a dark red flush crept up from his neck, suffusing his cheeks with the mottled color of pure, impotent rage. His hands on the table clenched into white-knuckled fists. Jessica was a wreck. Her carefully constructed poise had shattered, and she stared into the middle distance, her eyes wide and unblinking, as if she were watching a multi-million-dollar ghost float right through the wall. She had hitched her wagon to a star, only to watch it become a black hole. But it was Dr. Sterling who reacted first. She was a professional, and she knew a professional disaster when she saw one. She had come here to observe a subject for a competency hearing, not to witness a financial execution. She rose from her chair, with a quiet, efficient grace, her professional mask firmly back in place. "Well," she said, her voice a crisp, neutral instrument, "this has been a most illuminating evening, but I'm afraid I have a very early start tomorrow. I must be going." She didn't look at Kevin or Jessica. She nodded once, a curt, clinical gesture in my direction. And then she turned and walked out of the room, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor, a sound of retreat. The performance was officially over. With her departure, the last pretense of civility vanished, leaving the three of us alone in the raw, ugly wreckage. I pushed my chair back, the legs making a soft scraping sound on the floor, and I stood up. I was no longer playing the part of a frail old man. I stood tall, and for the first time that evening, I felt the full weight of my years, not as a burden, but as a source of strength. Kevin's eyes, burning with a furious hatred, finally met mine. He opened his mouth to speak, to rage, to curse, but I gave him no opportunity. I had one last thing to say. You were always obsessed with the value of assets, Kevin. I said, my voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the silent room. The price of a stock, the square footage of a house, the number on a bank statement. You learned how to calculate worth with incredible precision, but you never ever learned the value of a legacy. I looked at him, my son, and I felt not anger, but a deep, profound pity. Your mother, I continued, left behind a legacy. It wasn't in a portfolio. It was in the books she read, the knowledge she shared, the kindness she showed. It was a legacy of love and of the enduring power of the human spirit. Tonight, I did not take anything from you. I simply protected her legacy from you. I reached into my pocket and took out a single old-fashioned brass key. It was the key to the front door of the house he grew up in, the house that was no longer mine. I stepped forward and placed it gently on the polished table next to his clenched fist. It looked small and insignificant in the vast, empty space. The sound it made was tiny, a soft click of metal on wood, but it felt as final as a gavel striking down a verdict. I did not wait for a response. There was nothing more to say. I turned my back on my son and his wife and the ruins of their greed. I walked out of their cold, empty house and into the cool, clean air of the night. As the heavy door closed behind me, I did not feel the bitter triumph of revenge. I did not feel joy. I felt a vast quiet and profound peace. I had not won a battle against my son. I had won back my own life. I had honored my wife's memory. I had reclaimed my dignity. And that was a victory worth more than any fortune. This story teaches us a powerful lesson. True strength is often quiet, and wisdom should never be mistaken for weakness. Edward's son saw his father merely as a financial asset, to be controlled, blinded by greed, to the lifetime of experience and strategic thinking that lay beneath a calm exterior. It is a profound reminder that a person's value is not measured by the fortune they possess, but by the integrity of the legacy they have built. When faced with ultimate disrespect, the greatest victory lies not in emotional reaction, but in quiet, decisive action that protects one's dignity. If you believe that wisdom and dignity are the most powerful assets of all, please like this video, subscribe for more stories of justice served, and share your thoughts in the comments below.